This is TWiT.
Apple comes under fire for Patreon commission degrading its brand. This is from 9 to 5 Mac. So Apple is charging, talk about rent seeking, 30% to subscriptions to Patreon creators that you buy on the Apple device. Gruber himself at Daring Fireball said Apple's degrading its brand. Macworld says the company's charging for providing negative value. Patreon says, all right, we're going to add 30% if you want to subscribe on Apple devices.
Yeah, this is I've always said that Apple is generally like a very nice company. If it were a person, it's someone that you enjoy hanging out with. They're nice. They have interesting ideas. The App Store is drunk Apple. It's like, okay, I don't want any part of this. And this is just so stupid. So according to Patreon, they had sort of like a handshake agreement, like that. Okay, well, technically, we'll say that your memberships, Patreon memberships, don't really count for a 30% kickback to Apple for whatever reason. But recently, Apple said no. You have to. The app has to switch over to Apple's payment system and has to kick over 30% of all fees and all subscriptions that go back.
Position on this is that there is an exemption if the money the users pay goes 100% to the recipient, but because Patreon takes a cut, 10, by the way, 10, I should 12%. Mention, our club TWiT is through a Patreon company called Memberful. Same thing. Yeah. So because Patreon takes a cut of that money, Apple says, no, we're going to have to, starting in November, we're going to have to, they're going to have to be in-app purchases, and Apple will apply a 30% App Store fee to all new memberships.
This is just absolutely disgusting behavior, okay? Because I've never liked this aspect of the App Store billing, even when it was defending, quote unquote, like Amazon and booksellers from saying, well, why do I have to spend 30% more for a book? Like, what did Apple do to justify a 30% cut of a $25 online book purchase? They did nothing. If anything, the presence of the Amazon and the Kindle app on the iPhone platform helps Apple and helps the iPhone, but they've done nothing to justify a 30% cut. Now, when you get down to like a good friend of mine and an artist, Danielle Corsetto, does amazing stuff on Patreon. She's a cartoonist. She's done she completed a 12-year run on a comic strip called Girls with Slingshots. She's starting a brand new graphic novel. And for my happy fee, she does weekly, like a daily comic, like every weekday, in addition to art lessons, in addition to sneak peeks, all this sort of stuff. And now the idea that she will receive 30% less from people who like sign up for Patreon via the app, because Apple decides that, no, they're 30% responsible for that artwork. They're 30% responsible for that audience. They did 30% of the work, and by God, they're sick and tired of being cheated. Like, what a bunch of chiselers! This is really, really disgusting behavior on their part. Okay,
John Gruber writes, Patreon's messaging on this change seems pitch perfect to me. They're not whining. They're not calling for users to get their pitchforks out. But also, they're making crystal clear that these changes and the timeline for implementing them are demanded by Apple, and that Patreon benefits from these changes not at all.
Well, and I think the problem that Apple has is that Jack Conte is probably the coolest CEO in Silicon in the world.
Yeah,
he's just such a cool dude, and I think that it's just really not the guy, because he's not the guy that's going to get into the big crazy fight with you, but he's still going to win, and so I think that the problem is he's just so nice. And
you're saying he's not epic. He's
not going to get hyperbolic. He's just he's just saying, hey, this is what we have to do, and this is what we're going to do. He's not throwing lawsuits. He's not throwing whatever, and he's allowing the market to do what it's going to do, which is be upset, and I think it's very odd. I think the hard part is that, because Apple's also talking about, you can't go around them and everything else, but it's kind of like, okay, well, with Kindles, I'm buying stuff from a web page, like I'm subscribing, I'm buying the books from a web page. I can't buy them in the Kindle app on the phone or whatever. I don't think Apple's getting any part of that, and they're not charging, when people subscribe to, it could be easy enough for people to say, well, if they subscribe on Patreon's web page instead of their app, that they get to keep it all. And I think that Apple's closing that door on this as well, I believe.
Hamish
I'm not 100%
McKenzie,
sure.
who's the founder of Substack, writes on his Substack about this. He's the title of the article, "The Price of Payments, How Should In-App Purchases Work in the Age of the Sovereign Creator?" And his point is really, well, this is a kind of a whole new thing, and Apple's just been caught out by the emergence of the creator economy. He says it presents an interesting challenge and opportunity for Apple, and some delicate questions for Patreon, and yes, for his company Substack. We want creators and subscribers to benefit from the power of Apple's in-app purchases. I mean, that's a very, as you've always said, Alex, a super convenient way of doing this for anybody who's selling. He says, in fact, at Substack, we've been working with Apple to bring in-app purchases into our app. But, he asks, how much is the ease of in-app purchases worth to creators? That's the salient question. We found that creators are comfortable sharing 10% of their revenue for Substack's tools, but another 30% on top of that? At first blush, that price seems high, but we have firsthand experience seeing the potential that could be unlocked when the company gets its model and execution right. And we're grateful to our relationship with Stripe, for example, for similar reasons.
And to be clear, I just want to make sure we're clear about what we're talking about here, is that it's not affecting current subscribers. So this is from Patreon's own. So
starts in November.
And it's only applied to purchases that happen within the iOS environment. So, and I will say, I didn't even know I could pay for Patreon on the iOS environment. Like, it didn't even occur to me that was
I think
possible.
I am, actually.
And
this is the convenience that Apple offers, plus the ability to unsubscribe very easily, which is I think a big feature. Makes me want to pay for everything in the App Store.
It does, but that's the value that Apple brings to the user. So the thing is that it is.
But is it worth 30%?
Other payment systems exist. They're not that much harder to work with. Well, I do like the idea of having a central dashboard for all my subscriptions, but this is Patreon. I already have a central dashboard for all my subscriptions.
That's true.
Well, and I have to admit, I kind of don't want to know. Like, when I subscribe to a bunch of Patreons, and I have a bunch of people that I pay. I have like a $5 or $10 thing, and it's because I believe in them. I don't really, I'm not here to try to get whatever special value I'm supposed to get. I just think that that's an artist that should be supported, and I just give them money. And I kind of don't want to see it. I kind of want to show up, think do I really need to do that? I'm happy with a couple dollars, rolling out every month to some folks. I know that if a lot of people do that, they can keep on doing what they're doing. But I will say, so I just want to make sure we're clear, though. It's not like we're going back and Apple suddenly saying you have to pay 30% of everything that,
No. Just for new subscriptions.
And it's just for new subscriptions that are there in the app.
And you have to do it on iOS.
Because Apple. Go ahead, Alex.
What will quickly happen is that creators will tell people to go, the result of this will probably be the creators in every one of their streams and everything else. Number one is they can set it up so that it's 30% more, and 30% more on the App Store. And number two is that they'll tell people
just quickly,
constantly.
Patreon is saying we've added a feature so that if you want that to happen, click this button and it will be handled for you automatically. They're recommending that people don't do that, but they're trying to make it as easy as possible for
And then because that's what X did, right? X just says it's 30% more if you subscribe through your phone. Like they just.
Does everybody do this? Spotify do that? I think a number of people charge extra. Yeah.
Yeah, they keep on charging more. So I don't know. I mean,
it's hard to tell.
Turning it up. I don't know we don't know exactly what they're turning it up for. I stopped paying for Spotify.
Jason, are you a Patreon? Do you have Patreon on your
I do
site?
Memberful, like you do, which is
but that's Patreon.
Same company, but it's sort of white labeled and not really it's not really crowdfunding. It's a different kind of thing, which I prefer, and I know you guys prefer it too. It's good. Yeah. But I think this does. I agree with everything Andy said, but I think this is just Apple at its basest rent-seeking behavior, where it believes that if there's anything that happens on the iPhone, they deserve a cut. That's basically what it is, unless it's in a web browser, in which case they probably aren't happy about it, but it's not going to get a cut. But I wanted to say, even with Apple's own terms, it actually shows you a way that Apple is behind the times in understanding how this stuff works, because Apple has based everything that it's tried to do to make them seem not as bad over the last few years on the idea of, look, we're not trying to soak the little guy. And so they did their whole small business program where they only take 15%, right? And
after an outrage,
there's this whole idea, right? And the problem with that is Patreon is the interface with Apple. So as far as Apple's concerned, even though I saw somebody estimate it's well over 90%, and it may be more like 95% of Patreon's people they would qualify for the small business program. Because they're all rolled into Patreon, they just have to pay 30% forever. They don't get 15%.
And that seems
they don't
like
even get the half off. And we could argue like even the half off, even the 15% is not so great. But the fact that isn't even an issue here because Apple has decided, no, there's just one thing and it's an app and it's Patreon and they're the middleman. And therefore we are also now the middleman. And there's two middlemen, which you can't do. It doesn't work economically, but Apple's rules, and again, I see people argue like, well, but these are the rules. It's like Apple makes the rules. Apple could change the rules. They choose not to.
Yeah. And I think that, and I will say that, I mean, again, I think that eventually the process of having subscribers paying the full boat is going to end. Like Apple, yes. This is not a sustainable. This is whether it's Epic or Patreon or dating apps or whatever. The process of this, it's going to be like publishers are treated slightly differently. With what percentages they pay. That Apple kind of capitulated to, and I think that this is an area that because of some of the stuff I do, we pay a lot of attention to. and you just know that it's not, the 30% is definitely not sustainable. The 15 is probably not sustainable. I think that for subscription services like Patreon, it's going to probably land somewhere between 5 and 10%. It's not going to be zero, sure, but it's not going to be 30. And I think that's going to be, yeah.
This will put pressure on Apple. Apple's premise in all of this is that the in-app purchase is so convenient and such a great experience that it's worth a 30% tariff. That's basically what they believe. They believe it's so great. And the counter argument to that is what will probably happen with Patreon, which is, people will start buying things outside of the app more than they already do. I think all my Patreon subscriptions are from the web anyway.
Again,
right?
I didn't even know I could do that.
I didn't either. And I think what's interesting about that is if Apple is more or less wrong here and that people will just use the web, that puts pressure on Apple to compete a little bit, right? Like, what is the right number of percentage that you would be willing to give to Apple in order to make it that much easier to give you money via your Apple credit card, linked thing via in-app purchase? And I'm sure there is a number. I've talked to developers who actually feel like the 15% for them for apps is pretty good, and apps are a little bit different, but it's that idea of like, well, yeah, but it's just right there. And the problem is there's convenience, but like, what is that number, and will we ever see that? Because I do think that Patreon ultimately is just all those subscriptions are just going to go to the web because nobody's going to want to pay Apple.
Yeah, and Apple's argument, of course, is that people are only upset because they want to be able to do this because it's really convenient because they built an infrastructure that made that happen. The issue is that it is a huge damper on a potentially massive market. So the subscription market, the marketplaces, and I'm not talking about like the second marketplace. I mean, that's why they want to build the second marketplace. And I think that Apple's creating these second marketplaces, and they're creating all of this stuff by making it too high for that specific vertical. And I don't think that they have to give up 15% per app to say, if you're doing a subscription service or a sub marketplace inside, we're going to take a smaller percentage to allow that to flourish, because I think potentially on Apple's side, it could make a lot more money.
They would
if
just
everyone's
have to
buying
choose
and
to do
selling, but people aren't buying and selling at the rate that they could on iOS. I would argue that it is probably 10 times less usage of a marketplace in the App Store because of the percentages that Apple takes. If Apple made it 5% or 7% for a marketplace, like define it, like this is a marketplace, you're selling things. And now people will argue, well, now they're going to sell all their apps inside of that, and then Apple makes less. So it's got to be, they can set up a subscription service, and it's this, and they can put it into a small window. But there is a lot of opportunity there that is just not, it doesn't exist at 15%, and it doesn't exist at 30%, and it would flourish at 5 or 7 or something like that.
Right.
You know, and
this is untenable
for that specific, but that for a specific vertical, I don't think that they have to like unroll the whole thing.
Right. Yeah,
but
they can make a new program with new rules. And in fact, given the way this story has gone so far, I would not bet against the fact that Apple will at some point announce they're doing a new friendly thing that is for certain kinds of content through certain kinds of apps where they change. Somebody's pointed out that if Apple took its percentage from Patreon's percentage, that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, Patreon wouldn't like it, right? But it wouldn't be Apple taking candy away from a baby, right? It would be a different story. It would be like I could see them saying, "Oh, well, we've got this new program for independent creators that we're with special partners, starting with Patreon and Substack, that it's going to work this way." And because Alex is right, you know, I do believe at this point that they are preventing a whole other class of transaction from flourishing.
And I think this is where they get themselves. And I think this is where they get themselves into antitrust, is by using a marketplace. And when you start to see users completely not able, a market not even occurring because of something that they're doing, they put themselves in a real bind. And I think that they're going to have to solve this pretty quickly now. Like, you know, and I think, you know,
it's a bad mistake to make for a company that relies on creators.
It seems like an unforced error.
And keeps hawking on itself as being a very human-oriented company. This is one of the main...
creators may be a little sensitive after the giant press crushed all of their tools for creation into an iPad. I think creators might, at this point, you know, it only takes so long before they start thinking, oh, you know, maybe Apple isn't.
Yeah, but the
creator company, you know,
that ad didn't cost anybody money. That's the big difference. It's like to me, it just comes down. There've been a lot of really good arguments.
But it's just it's a pile on. It's more of the same.
It doesn't feel good when there are a lot of huge success stories on Patreon. When you can do the math and see, well, if this person, according to the bio page, they have currently 2,000 something paid Patreon supporters, and their minimum support level is like $5. You can calculate how much money they're making on Patreon, okay? But there aren't a lot of those success stories. For a lot of people, it's like this is the ability to make this I need 2 jobs in order to get by in the world. With Patreon, my second job can be creating art and selling prints and writing stuff and being a creator instead of, you know, cleaning houses or flipping burgers. And now when Apple, a $2 trillion company, says that, oh, you know, that $75 like beautiful hand-bound book that you sell through Patreon. This is Danielle Corsetto put her entire comic series, this beautiful 2-volume slipcase. Like, I'm entitled. Apple said, this $2 trillion company saying I'm entitled to 30% of that price because we feel as though we've justified 30% a cut from that transaction because of all the value that we've created for you. And when you think about how on the App Store, and again, it used to be a lot less fair for creators over there too, until Apple started to feel the heat and they suddenly decided to start dropping prices and eliminating prices for people who are small creators. When you realize that as an app developer, if I'm a small app developer, I don't make a whole lot of money off of it. I'm using Apple's App Store to market and sell my app. I have to, but again, that's a value. I'm using Apple's developer tools to build my app, which I have to, but again, that's value. I'm using Apple's APIs. I have to, but that's a valuable thing. Apple can say that, well, yeah, they did contribute a lot to my ability to make this great app, and even so, I'm making $500 or $600 a month. They're taking none of it. But again, Apple says that book that you're selling for $75, we deserve 30%. We deliver so much value for that transaction. Right. You owe us. Thank God for us, because otherwise, how will you be able to sell this book through
That's where it falls apart, right? Yeah. Is that they're no longer making we're building the APIs and the developer tools and all those things. And this goes back to I think when I said that they're kind of behind the times, I think this is what it is, right? Is that they view everything through the lens of app developers owing them money. And the problem here is that just as Amazon is not an app developer when it's selling you a book on Kindle, Patreon is not an app developer when it is acting as a conduit so that a whole bunch of people who are never going to build their own apps can reach an audience. It's something different. And that 30% or even 15% makes some sort of sense. We've argued about it, but some sort of sense. At least I'm willing to hear the argument of like, oh, well, we built the infrastructure and the apps and all that. But for something like this, it really comes down to, well, we're providing a payment infrastructure and we helped your app developer build their app. But like, come on, it doesn't scale when you're talking about thousands of creators. And so, yeah, it's an own goal. It's an unforced error. And it's something that they probably will maybe address at some point because it makes them look terrible.
The reality is it looks really, really bad for Apple. It probably will not affect the creators that much because they're going to focus everybody on buying stuff from the web. Their current subscribers are not going to be affected. So there's not going to be like, it's probably not going to have an actual impact on that many creators it's very unlikely.
I would not downplay the impact these days of the YouTube influencer.
No,
and
I'm
if
saying
you start to get a campaign on YouTube.
Oh, no, I'm
people
saying,
going, Apple is evil.
Right.
It could actually impact you.
What I'm saying is I don't think it's going to financially actually impact the creators that much.
No, I understand, but don't piss off creators.
No, and I was going to say, I was going to say it's not going to affect them financially that much. It's not going to make, as a result, it's not going to make Apple very much money. It's just going to put Apple in a big white hot place, and there's no upside to this for Apple than, and there's all downside. I think that they're going to have to find a middle way pretty quickly because they're going to keep burning until they get their hands off the plate.
The Macalope writing in Macworld, to your point, Andy, said, Apple's forcing creators into funding models that work for Apple, but not necessarily for them. A lot of creators create things when they have the time to create them, not on some predefined schedule. Apple's obsession with subscription-based revenue is something that lets it level out its quarterly results, but it's now having a knock-on effect on other platforms.
I wonder if they're going to change if they do wind up losing that $22 billion a year from Google for Google search placement on its devices. I wonder if they're going to be encouraging themselves to find a way to make up for that shortfall in services wherever they can. So I hope that this isn't the start of something really, really bad.
Yeah. Well,
or worse.
We'll see what the backlash is. It ain't going to be good. Hey, it's Leo Laporte. If you enjoyed this little snippet of our programming, make sure you check out the full MacBreak Weekly. The link is right down there.